It's amazing to me how complex the world of just keeping our stuff safe online has gotten.
It really
I
has.
mean, it's not just about having a strong password anymore, is it?
No, not at all. And frankly, it can feel kind of overwhelming.
Right, like every day there's a new headline about some massive data breach or some crazy new vulnerability.
Yeah, and trying to keep up with all of it can feel like a full-time job.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
who has time for that,
Yeah,
right? So that's where this deep dive comes in.
that's right.
What we do is we take a ton of information. Like today, we've got some fascinating excerpts from ethical hacking training modules, and we sift through it all to bring you the need-to-know stuff.
And honestly, these training modules are particularly interesting because they're not just theoretical.
Yeah.
They're designed to teach people how to actually do this stuff. So they offer a very practical perspective on how these vulnerabilities are found and exploited.
So today, we're focusing on the vulnerabilities that can crop up in our networks and applications.
Okay, sounds good.
And these sources really get into the nitty-gritty of how these vulnerabilities are exploited and, more importantly, how we can defend against them.
Right. And that's the goal, right? To give people a solid grasp of the essentials without getting too bogged down in the technical details.
Exactly. We're shooting for those aha moments, those moments where something clicks and it all starts to make sense.
I like that.
So let's jump right in.
Right.
The first area our sources explore is Windows name resolution and SMB attacks.
Okay.
And right off the bat, we encounter a term that might not be familiar to everyone, name resolution.
Right.
So can you break that down for us in simple terms?
Sure. So think of name resolution like an address book for your network.
Right?
When you want to access something on your network, like a shared folder or a printer, you usually refer to it by its name, right? Something like file server or printer one.
Right.
But computers, they don't speak in names. They speak in numbers, IP addresses. So name resolution, that's where protocols like NetBIOS, LMNR, and DNS come in. They act as the translator. They take those user-friendly names and convert them into the IP addresses that computers understand.
So it's like the middleman.
Exactly. Without name resolution, your computer would have no idea how to find anything on the network.
Okay, that makes sense. And our sources emphasize these protocols, NetBIOS and LMNR, as being particularly relevant in Windows environments, right?
That's right. They're kind of the go-to name resolution protocols in most Windows networks.
Got it. They also mention specific ports and protocols associated with NetBIOS and SMB, like UDP 137, 138, TCP 135, 139, and TCP 445. Why are these technical details so important for understanding vulnerabilities?
Well, because these ports and protocols are like the doors that these services use to communicate.
Okay.
If those doors aren't properly secured, then they become potential entry points for attackers.
Ah, I see. So an attacker could potentially use those open doors to sneak in.
Exactly. And SMB, that's the server message block protocol. That one's particularly important because it's heavily used for things like file sharing and printer sharing in Windows environments.
So if there's a vulnerability in SMB, it could have a pretty big impact.
Absolutely, especially in a corporate environment where you have a lot of computers sharing files and resources.
The sources also draw a distinction between Windows workgroups and domain-based implementations.
Yeah.
Can you quickly explain the difference and why that matters from a security standpoint?
Sure. So a work group, that's like a small neighborhood. Everyone kind of knows each other and there's no central authority.
Okay,
Each computer manages its own security. It's a peer-to-peer setup.
got it.
Now, a domain, on the other hand, that's more like a big city with a central government.
Yep.
You've got domain controllers that manage security for all the computers in the domain, and users can log in to any computer within that domain using their domain credentials.
So it's a much more centralized system.
Exactly. And from a security perspective, that means the potential attack surface is much larger.
Right. If an attacker compromises a domain controller, they potentially have access to the entire network.
Exactly. And that's why securing domain controllers is so critical.
Now, here's where it gets really interesting. The modules start discussing exploiting these protocols. And they mention tools like NBN Spoof, Metasploit, Puppy, and Responder. What are these tools and what makes them so powerful?
Well, these are tools that are used by both security professionals and attackers to find and exploit vulnerabilities in these protocols.
Okay.
Like NBN Spoof, for example, that can be used to spoof NetBIOS name resolution responses, basically tricking computers into connecting to the wrong server.
So I think I'm starting to see the danger here. If an attacker can redirect my computer to their server, they could potentially steal my login credentials or install malware.
Exactly. And then you've got tools like Metasploit, which is a really popular framework for penetration testing and exploit development.
And what about Puppy?
So Puppy, that's an interesting one. It's a post-exploitation tool written in Python. It's often used to establish a backdoor on a compromised system, and it can even be used by malware.
So even malware uses these kinds of tools. That's a bit scary.
It is. It shows you how sophisticated and readily available these attack tools have become.
Speaking of sophisticated attacks, Eternal Blue gets a lot of attention in the sources.
Right. MS-17-010.
Can you explain what makes this exploit so dangerous?
So Eternal Blue, that was a really nasty exploit that took advantage of a flaw in how SMB handled certain types of requests.
Okay.
And what made it particularly dangerous was that it could be exploited remotely without needing any prior authentication.
So an attacker could potentially exploit this vulnerability from anywhere in the world.
Exactly. And it was used in a number of high-profile ransomware attacks like WannaCry and NotPetya.
Wow, so this one vulnerability caused a lot of damage.
It did, and it really highlights the importance of keeping systems patched and up to date.
The training material even provides a step-by-step example of how to use Eternal Blue in Metasploit, using commands like use exploit Windows MEMS 1218 Eternal Blue show options, setting the target and local host IP addresses, and then running the exploit command.
Yeah.
What's the takeaway for someone seeing those commands laid out like that?
I think the takeaway is how easy it can be to exploit a vulnerability like this using readily available tools.
Wow.
With just a few commands, someone with even limited technical skills could potentially launch a serious attack.
And the sources also mention the exploit database and the searchsploit command as resources for finding SMB vulnerabilities. It seems like there's a whole library of these things out there.
There is, and it's constantly being updated with new vulnerabilities as they're discovered.
So it's an ongoing cat and mouse game between security researchers and attackers.
Exactly. The good guys are finding the vulnerabilities and trying to get them patched, while the bad guys are looking for ways to exploit them before they're fixed.
Finally, in the SMB section, they briefly mention using Enum4 Linux for scanning and SIM client for file transfer. What are these tools used for in relation to SMB security?
So Enum4 Linux, that's a handy tool for gathering information about systems that are running SMB.
Okay.
It can tell you things like what versions of SMB are running, what users and shares are available, things like that.
So an attacker could use this tool to kind of map out the target network.
Exactly. They can use it to identify potential targets and weaknesses.
And what about SIM client?
So SIM client, that's a command line tool that you can use to interact with SMB shares. Like you can use it to connect to a shared folder and browse or transfer files.
So if an attacker has gained access to a system, they could use SIM client to steal sensitive data.
Exactly.
Okay, moving on from SMB, the next network vulnerability highlighted is DNS cache poisoning. This one sounds like it could have pretty widespread effects. Can you explain what it is?
Yeah, so DNS cache poisoning, it's kind of like tampering with the phone book. You know, DNS remembers the IP addresses of websites you visited, so it doesn't have to look them up every time.
Great to speed things up.
Exactly. But in a cache poisoning attack, the young hacker tries to inject fake DNS records into the DNS server's cache.
So it's like replacing the real phone number with a fake one.
Exactly. And when your computer tries to access a website, it ends up connecting to the attacker's server instead.
Oh, I see. So I might think I'm going to my bank's website, but I'm actually on the attacker's server.
Right. And they can then steal your login credentials or install malware.
That's pretty scary. The source even shows an example of how this redirection process works. It's amazing how these attackers can manipulate the systems we rely on.
Yeah, it really is. And it underscores the importance of having secure DNS practices in place.
Next up, we have SNMP exploits. Now, I know SNMP is used for managing network devices. Why is this a potential attack vector?
So SNMP, the Simple Network Management Protocol, it's used to monitor and manage all sorts of devices on a network, like routers, switches, servers, you name it. But if SNMP isn't properly secured, it can be a goldmine for attackers.
How so?
Well, SNMP allows you to gather a lot of sensitive information about devices, their configurations, their status. You can even use it to make changes to those devices.
Oh, so if an attacker gains access to SNMP, they could potentially reconfigure my router or shut down my server.
Exactly. Or they could use SNMP to map out your network, identify other potential targets, things like that.
The sources mention SNMP v2c and SNMP v3, with v3 being more secure, but both seem to have their weaknesses.
Yeah, so SNMP v2c, that relies on something called community strings for authentication, which are basically like passwords.
Okay.
The problem is that these community strings are often left at their default values or set to easily guessable passwords.
So an attacker could just try a few common community strings and gain access.
Exactly. And while SNMP-v3 is more secure, it still relies on usernames and passwords. And if those aren't strong enough, they can still be brute forced.
So even with newer versions, weak configurations can still be a problem. The modules talk about using Nmap scripting engine scripts and the sump and check tool for gathering information and brute forcing passwords. How do these tools make it easier for attackers to find and exploit SNMP weaknesses?
So these tools automate a lot of the work involved in scanning for SNMP devices and testing for known vulnerabilities.
Okay.
Like NSE scripts, for example, they can automatically query SNMP devices and look for things like weak community strings.
So it takes the manual work out of it.
Exactly. And
Okay.
Summit Check can do things like perform SNMP walks, which basically means it queries the device for all sorts of information about its configuration and status.
And all this information could be used to launch further attacks.
Exactly.
All right, moving on to email, we have SMTP exploits. Sources explain how attackers can leverage insecure SMTP servers for sending spam and feeding emails. Can you explain how that works?
Yeah, so SMTP Simple Mail Transfer Protocol, that's the protocol that's used to send email,
Right.
And if an SMTP server isn't properly configured, it can be abused by spammers and phishers to send out mass emails.
Huh.
Like one common misconfiguration is something called an open relay, which means that the server will accept email from anyone and forward it on to any recipient.
So it's like an open door for spam.
Exactly. And spammers love to find open relays because they can use them to send out huge volumes of spam without having to worry about being traced back to their own servers.
The sources mention an Nmap NSE script for testing open relay, so I guess it's pretty easy to check if a server is misconfigured.
It is, and it's something that security professionals routinely check for during vulnerability assessments.
There's also a list of SMTP commands that can be used for security evaluation. What can you learn by using these commands?
So these commands allow you to manually interact with an SMTP server and get information about its configuration.
Okay.
Like you can use the helo or eashel commands to see what the server identifies itself as. You can use starttls to check if it supports encrypted connections. You can use vrfy to see if a particular user exists on the server.
So you can kind of probe the server for information.
Exactly, and that information can be used to identify potential weaknesses.
This MTP user enum tool is introduced as a way to gather information about email server users. That sounds like it could be used for malicious purposes.
It definitely could. An attacker could use this tool to try and enumerate valid email addresses on a server.
So they could build a list of potential targets for phishing attacks.
Exactly.
And lastly, they mentioned that known SMTP exploits exist and can be found using the search exploit command. So just like with SMB, there's a whole database of potential vulnerabilities.
There is, and attackers are always looking for ways to exploit those vulnerabilities before they're patched.
So it's a constant race against time.
It is.
Let's move on to FTP exploits the sources, highlight the risk of anonymous FTP login. Why is this a security concern?
So FTP file transfer protocol, that's a really old protocol for transferring files between computers.
Okay.
And back in the day, it was pretty common for FTP servers to allow anonymous login, which meant that anyone could connect without a username or password.
Okay.
But obviously, that's a huge security risk because anyone could potentially access sensitive files on the server.
Right.
And even though anonymous FTP isn't as common these days, it's still something that attackers will check for because you never know when you might find a server that's misconfigured.
The training material shows how to use Nmap and Metasploit to test for anonymous FTP login. They even mentioned the VSFTPD configuration file. What's the key takeaway here?
Well, the takeaway is that it's really easy to test for this vulnerability, and if you're running an FTP server, you should absolutely make sure that anonymous login is disabled.
And they provide a whole list of best practices for mitigating FTP abuse, including strong passwords file and folder security encryption, locking down admin accounts, and keeping software updated. These seem like pretty basic security principles.
They are, but they're essential because FTP servers can be a real target for attackers.
Okay, next up we have pass the hash attacks.
Nice.
And this one sounds a bit more technical. Can you explain the basic concept?
Sure. So in Windows, your password isn't stored in plain text. It's stored as a hash,
Okay.
which is basically a scrambled version of the password.
Yeah.
And in a pass the hash attack, the attacker doesn't actually need to know your password.
Really?
All they need is the hash of your password.
And how do they get the hash?
Well, if they compromise a system where your password hash is stored, they can just grab it.
Okay.
And then they can use that hash to authenticate to other systems on the network as you without ever actually knowing your password.
So it's like they're bypassing the password altogether.
Exactly.
The sources mention NTLM and Kerberos as authentication protocols used in Windows. How do these relate to pass-the-hash attacks?
So NTLM, that's an older authentication protocol, and it's particularly vulnerable to pass-the-hash attacks.
Yeah.
Kerberos is more secure, but NTLM is still used in some situations, so it's still a threat.
Got it.
And then there's Empire, which is a post-exploitation framework that can be used to launch what's called a golden ticket attack.
A golden ticket attack, what's that?
So a golden ticket attack, that's a type of Kerberos attack where the attacker creates a forged Kerberos ticket granting ticket or TGT. And with a golden ticket, they can essentially impersonate any user in the domain.
Wow. So it's like having a master key to the entire network.
Exactly.
Then there's the Kerberos silver ticket attack.
Yeah.
How does this differ from the golden ticket?
So a silver ticket attack that's more targeted, it's a forged ticket for a specific service on a specific server.
Okay.
Like if an attacker wanted to access files on a particular file server, they could create a silver ticket for that server.
Got it. And what about on-path attacks? They mentioned MA spoofing. What's the goal there?
So in MA spoofing, the attacker changes the MSID address of their network interface card.
And the MSC, that's like the physical address of the device, right?
Exactly. And by spoofing their MSA address, the attacker can pretend to be another device on the network.
And why would they want to do that?
Well, it could be to bypass security measures that are based on MAC address filtering, or it could be to perform a man-in-the-middle attack where they intercept traffic between two other devices.
Oh, I see. So they could potentially eavesdrop on my communication.
Exactly.
They also mentioned manipulating spanning tree protocol, or STP. What's that all about?
So STP, that's a protocol that's used to prevent loops in Ethernet networks.
Okay.
And an attacker can manipulate STP to create a loop which can cause all sorts of problems on the network.
Like what?
Well, it can lead to broadcast storms, which basically flood the network with traffic and can bring it to a halt.
Oh, wow. So it's like a denial of service attack.
Exactly.
Then we have route manipulation attacks, specifically BGP hijacking. How does that work and how could it affect me?
So BGP Border Gateway Protocol, that's the protocol that's used to route traffic between different internet service providers.
Okay.
And in a BGP hijacking attack, the attacker essentially takes control of a BGP router and announces fake routes.
So they could potentially redirect all my internet traffic through their server.
Exactly, and they could then eavesdrop on your traffic or modify it in some way.
That's scary.
It is, and it's a real threat because BGP is a very complex protocol and it's not always easy to secure.
Downgrade attacks are next. The example given is the PUDLA vulnerability in OpenSSL. What's the idea behind a downgrade attack?
So in a downgrade attack, the attacker tries to force the system to use an older, less secure version of a protocol.
Okay.
Like in the PUDI attack, the attacker could force a web server to use SSLv3, which is a really old and insecure version of SSL.
And why would they want to do that?
Because older versions of protocols often have known vulnerabilities that can be exploited.
So it's like tricking the system into using a weaker lock.
Exactly.
Then we get into DOS and DDoS attacks. We've all probably experienced the frustration of a website being down because of one of these attacks.
Yeah.
What are the different types of DOS attacks?
So there are three main types of DOS attacks: direct, reflected, and amplification.
Okay, can you break those down for us?
Sure. So in a direct attack, the attacker directly floods the target with traffic.
Okay.
In a reflected attack, the attacker sends traffic to another server but spoofs the source IP address to make it look like the traffic is coming from the target.
So the other server ends up sending a bunch of traffic to the target without realizing it.
Exactly. And then in an amplification attack, the attacker sends a small request to a server, but that request triggers a much larger response from the server, which is then sent to the target.
So it's like amplifying the attack traffic.
Exactly.
What about network access control or NEC bypass? How does NEC work and how can attackers try to get around it?
So NEC, that's a security measure that's used to control which devices are allowed to connect to a network.
Okay.
It typically involves checking the device's security posture to make sure it meets certain requirements, like having up-to-date antivirus software.
So it's like a bouncer for the network.
Exactly, but attackers can try to bypass NEC using various techniques like NAC address spoofing, where they pretend to be a device that's already authorized to be on the network.
And what about VLAN hopping? How does that work?
So VLANs, virtual LANs, they're used to segment a network into smaller logical networks. And in VLAN hopping, the attacker tries to jump from one VLAN to another, potentially gaining access to sensitive data or systems.
So like breaking down the walls between different parts of the network.
Exactly. And there are a few different ways to do this, like double tagging, where the attacker adds 2 VLAN tags to a packet, or exploiting misconfigurations in the switch.
Finally, for network vulnerabilities, we have DHCP starvation attacks and rogue DHCP servers. What's the goal of a DHCP starvation attack?
So DHCP, Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol, that's the protocol that's used to automatically assign IP addresses to devices on a network.
Right.
And in a DHCP starvation attack, the attacker floods the DHCP server with requests for IP addresses.
And what's the purpose of that?
The goal is to exhaust the DHCP server's pool of available IP addresses.
So legitimate devices can't get an IP address and can't connect to the network?
Exactly.
And then the attacker can set up their own rogue DHCP server.
Right. And when a device tries to connect to the network, it gets an IP address from the rogue DHCP server instead of the legitimate one.
And that gives the attacker control over the device's traffic.
Exact.
That was a very comprehensive overview of wired network vulnerabilities.
It was.
So let's move on to wireless now, starting with evil twin attacks.
Okay.
This sounds like a classic way to trick people into connecting to a malicious network. How does it work?
So in an evil twin attack, the attacker sets up a fake Wi-Fi access point that's designed to look like a legitimate one.
Okay.
Like they might use the same SID as a nearby coffee shop or hotel.
So if I'm trying to connect to the Wi-Fi at Starbucks, the attacker could set up an evil twin with the same name.
Exactly. And if you connect to the evil twin, the attacker can then intercept your traffic.
So they could steal my passwords or credit card information.
Exactly.
Yikes. The sources also talk about passive reconnaissance as a first step in many wireless attacks. What kind of information can an attacker gather just by listening to Wi-Fi signals?
So passive reconnaissance that just involves listening to wireless traffic without actively interacting with any networks. And even just by passively listening, an attacker can gather a lot of information like SSIDs, MSC addresses, signal strengths, things like that.
So they can get a sense of what networks are out there and what devices are connected.
Exactly. And they can use that information to plan further attacks.
The sources mention tools like Kismet and Kismac for passive reconnaissance. What are those?
So those are tools that allow you to capture and analyze wireless traffic.
Okay.
They can be used for both legitimate purposes like troubleshooting Wi-Fi problems and for malicious purposes like reconnaissance.
And they also mention air monitoring. What's that?
So air monitoring, that's a tool that's part of the air cracking suite, which is a collection of tools for wireless security testing.
Okay.
And air monitoring is used to put your wireless interface into monitor mode, which allows it to capture all wireless traffic, even traffic that's not directed at your device.
Oh, so it's like turning your Wi-Fi card into a listening device.
Exactly.
What about disassociation or deauthentication attacks? How do those work?
So in a deauthentication attack, the attacker sends a forged deauthentication packet to a client device.
And what does that do?
It basically tells the client device to disconnect from the Wi-Fi network.
And why would an attacker want to do that?
Well, it could be to disrupt the network, or it could be to force the client device to reconnect, which would then allow the attacker to capture the handshake.
And the handshake, that's the process that's used to establish a secure connection between the client and the access point, right?
Exactly. And if the attacker can capture the handshake, they can then try to crack the Wi-Fi password.
The sources mention for launching deauthentication attacks. What are those?
So arrow dumping, that's a tool for capturing wireless traffic, and airplaying, that's a tool for injecting packets into a wireless network.
Okay, so arrow dumping is used to capture the handshake, and airplaying is used to force the client device to reconnect.
Exactly.
Then we have WEP vulnerabilities. What makes WEP such a weak security protocol?
So WEP, wired equivalent privacy, that's a really old wireless security protocol, and it has a number of serious flaws.
Okay.
One of the biggest flaws is that it uses a very short initialization vector, or IV.
Okay.
And because the IV is so short, it gets reused frequently, which makes it vulnerable to statistical effects.
So an attacker could potentially capture enough packets to figure out the WEP key.
Exactly. And there are tools like air cracking that can automate the process of cracking WEP keys.
So even though WEP is old, it's still important to be aware of its weaknesses.
Absolutely, especially if you're dealing with older legacy systems.
WPA and WPA2 vulnerabilities are also covered. The first step in cracking these more modern protocols is capturing the WPA handshake. Can you walk us through how that's done?
Sure. So the first step is to put your wireless interface into monitor mode using AirMon.
Okay.
Then you use arrow dump in hang to capture traffic on the target network.
Right. Yeah.
And then you can use air planning to force a client device to reconnect to the network, which will trigger a handshake.
And once you have the handshake, you can try to crack it using air cracking.
Exactly.
The sources even show an example of a successful WPA handshake capture and crack it. It's amazing how easy it can be to break into these networks.
Yeah, it is, and it really highlights the importance of using strong passwords and keeping your systems updated.
They also mentioned WPS vulnerabilities. What's WPS and why is it vulnerable?
So WPS Wi-Fi protected setup, that's a feature that's supposed to make it easier to connect to Wi-Fi networks,
Did I?
but unfortunately it has a number of security flaws.
Like what?
Well, one of the biggest flaws is that it uses a PIN code to authenticate devices, and those PIN codes are often very easy to guess.
Really?
Yeah, and there are tools like Reaver that can automate the process of brute forcing WPS PIN codes.
So WPS is actually making things less secure.
In many cases, yes, it's definitely something to be aware of.
Karma attacks are briefly explained. How do those work?
So a karma attack is a type of evil twin attack where the attacker responds to probe requests from client devices.
And a probe request, that's basically a device asking if a particular network is available, right?
Exactly. And in a karma attack, the attacker responds to every probe request regardless of the network name.
So the device thinks it's connecting to the network it's looking for, but it's actually connecting to the attacker's evil twin.
Exactly.
What about wireless fragmentation attacks?
So those are attacks that target WEP networks, and they exploit the way that WEP handles fragmented packets.
Okay.
By sending specially crafted fragmented packets, the attacker can inject data into the network or even decrypt traffic.
So it's another way to bypass WEP security?
Exactly.
They also talk about credential harvesting. How do rogue access points play a role in that?
So rogue access points can be used to set up fake captive portals.
And a captive portal, that's that page you sometimes see when you connect to a public Wi-Fi network where you have to enter your email address or agree to some terms and conditions.
Exactly. But if the attacker sets up a fake captive portal, they can then steal your credentials.
So I might think I'm logging into the hotel's Wi-Fi, but I'm actually giving my credentials to the attacker.
Right.
They mention EtherCap as a tool for DNS spoofing. How does that fit into the picture?
So EtherCap, that's a tool that can be used to perform man-in-the-middle attacks. And one of the things it can do is DNS spoofing.
Okay.
So the attacker can use EtherCap to redirect your traffic to a fake website, even if you type in the correct URL.
So it's like they're tampering with the DNS system to point me to the wrong server.
Exactly.
Bluetooth exploits are briefly covered. They differentiate between bluejacking and blue snarfing. What's the difference?
So bluejacking, that's basically just sending unsolicited messages to Bluetooth devices.
Okay.
It's annoying, but it's not really that dangerous.
And blue snarfing?
Blue snarfing is much more serious because it involves stealing information from a Bluetooth device.
So they could potentially get my contacts or messages.
Exactly.
Finally, for wireless, we have RFID and NFC attacks. What are the risks associated with those technologies?
So RFID and NFC, they're both short-range wireless technologies that are used in a variety of applications like payment systems and access control.
Okay.
And because they're short-range, they're often seen as being secure, but there's still ways to attack them.
Like what?
Well, one common attack is RFID cloning, where the attacker copies the data from a legitimate RFID tag.
So they could potentially create a fake access card or payment card?
Exactly. And then there are NFC relay attacks, where the attacker uses two devices to relay the communication between a legitimate reader and a legitimate tag.
So they could potentially eavesdrop on a contactless payment transaction.
Exactly.
Wow, that was a whirlwind tour of wireless vulnerability.
It was.
Now let's dive into web application vulnerabilities, starting with the HTTP protocol.
Okay.
Why is it so important to understand HTTP when it comes to web application security?
Well, because HTTP, Hypertext Transfer Protocol, that's the foundation of the web. It's how web browsers communicate with web servers. And all web applications rely on HTTP to function. So if there's a vulnerability in HTTP, it can affect every web application out there.
The sources describe the request-response model of HTTP. Can you explain how that works?
Sure. So when you visit a website, your web browser sends an HTTP request to the web server.
Okay.
And that request includes things like the URL you're trying to access the method you're using, like BAT or PUST, and any headers or data you're sending.
And then the server responds.
Right, the server processes the request and sends back an HTTP response, which includes things like the status code, the headers, and the body of the response.
Okay.
And the body, that's usually the content of the web page you're trying to access.
Yeah. The sources also describe the structure of HTTP requests and responses
Yeah.
with headers and a body. What kind of information is contained in those?
So the headers, they contain metadata about the request or response, like the content type, the encoding, the length of the message, things like that.
Right.
And the body that contains the actual data being transmitted, like the HTML code of a web page or the data you're submitting in a form.
And why is it important to understand this structure from a security perspective?
Well, because attackers can try to manipulate the headers or the body of an HTTP request to do things like inject malicious code or steal sensitive information.
Ah, so it's another potential attack surface.
Exactly.
They list a bunch of common HTTP methods like get head, post trace, put delete options, and connect. Can you give us a quick overview of what each one does?
Sure. So get key, that's the most common method. It's used to retrieve data from a server.
Okay.
Head is similar to get, but it only retrieves the headers, not the body of the response.
Got it.
PSID is used to submit data to a server.
Okay.
Trace is used to echo back the request that was sent to the server.
Okay.
PT is used to upload a resource to the server.
Oh.
Delete is used to delete a resource from the server.
Okay.
Options is used to get information about the communication options available on the server.
Okay.
And connect is used to establish a tunnel to the server.
Got it. They also break down the structure of an HTTP URL with all its components, like the scheme, the host, the port, the path, the query string. Why is it important to understand the structure?
Well, because each component of a URL can be manipulated by an attacker.
Okay.
Like the query string, for example, that's often used to pass parameters to a web application. And if the application isn't properly sanitizing those,